Imagine a world where peace was not signed with ink on parchment, but woven into belts of shell and beads, where leaders sat in longhouses under smoke-filled rafters, not to conquer, but to balance powers, preserve harmony, and ensure survival. Long before the United States was born, indigenous nations of North America had mastered the art of diplomacy. Their negotiations with one another, and later with the European empires that arrived on their shores, shaped the very foundation of colonial America. Yet, these stories remain largely untold. When we think about diplomacy in early America, we often imagine powdered wigs, quills scratching on treaties, and European governors debating the future of the colonies. But behind these images lies a much deeper, more complex reality. Native leaders, interpreters, and negotiators stood at the very center of the colonial world, guiding and resisting, balancing and bargaining. This is not simply a story of war and conquest, of colonists versus native nations. It is a story of treaties, councils, gifts, alliances, and strategy. It is a story of intelligence and foresight. It is a story of how indigenous diplomacy both enabled and restrained the colonial project, often determining whether peace or bloodshed would follow. Why this story matters today. The history of early America is often told as if native peoples were passive, swept aside by European expansion. But nothing could be further from the truth. Indigenous nations were not only active participants in this history, they were its architects. They played European powers against one another, forging alliances that changed the course of wars. They set the rules of trade. They demanded recognition of sovereignty. And through their diplomacy, they managed to survive in a world that was rapidly transforming around them. By exploring these untold stories of indigenous diplomacy, we uncover an essential truth. America was not simply built on top of native nations, it was built with them, shaped by centuries of negotiation and exchange. The nature of indigenous diplomacy. Indigenous diplomacy was fundamentally different from European diplomacy. In Europe, negotiation was often rigid, legalistic, and grounded in written treaties. Among native nations, diplomacy was rooted in relationships, ceremony, and balance. Words alone were not enough. Promises had to be embodied in symbolic exchanges, wampum belts, sacred pipes, ritual feasts. These were not just gestures, but binding commitments, visible reminders of trust and obligation. A single string of wampum could carry more weight than a royal seal, because it represented not only words, but the spirit of the people. When Europeans arrived, they were forced to adapt to these traditions. Governors, traders, and missionaries often found themselves seated in great councils, speaking through interpreters, offering gifts, and waiting patiently as native leaders deliberated for days before responding. For colonists who came expecting dominance, this was a startling lesson. Survival depended on diplomacy, and diplomacy depended on respecting indigenous protocol. The stakes of diplomacy. Every diplomatic exchange in colonial America carried enormous stakes. For indigenous nations, diplomacy was a lifeline. It secured trade goods like iron tools, muskets, and textiles. It provided protection against rival tribes or encroaching settlers. It offered a way to preserve sovereignty in the face of invasion. For Europeans, diplomacy was equally vital. Colonists depended on native nations for food during their earliest years of settlement. They needed allies in wars against rival colonies and empires. They relied on indigenous guides, scouts, and warriors. Without native diplomacy, many colonial projects would have collapsed before they even began. The power was never one-sided. For much of the 1600s, indigenous nations held the upper hand in diplomacy. They had knowledge of the land, greater numbers, and strong political structures. Colonists were often forced to bend to native terms just to survive. The silence of history. And yet, when we open most history books, these stories are buried or erased. Treaties are remembered only for their failure, not their creation. Native negotiators are cast as secondary figures rather than leaders in their own right. The narrative is tilted toward colonial governors and European monarchs, as if diplomacy only began when a feather pen touched parchment. This silence is not accidental. For centuries, the contributions of native diplomacy were minimized or ignored, erased by colonial narratives that portrayed indigenous peoples as obstacles rather than partners. To tell this story truthfully, we must shift the perspective, looking not through European eyes, but through the experiences of native diplomats themselves. What this journey will explore. In this series, we will uncover the untold stories of indigenous diplomacy in colonial America. We will travel back to the world before colonization, where native nations had already established sophisticated systems of governance and negotiation. We will witness the first encounters between colonists and indigenous peoples in the early 1600s and see how diplomacy shaped survival. We will explore the role of trade, treaties, and alliances, and examine how indigenous nations balanced power between competing empires. We will look at diplomacy in times of war, from the Pequot conflict to the Revolutionary era. We will highlight the often overlooked contributions of women in negotiation and the rituals and spiritual traditions that gave diplomacy its meaning. By the end, we will see how indigenous diplomacy not only shaped the course of colonial America, but also influenced the very foundations of democracy and international relations that continue to this day. This is not a story of silence, but of voices long ignored. It is not a story of defeat, but of resilience, strategy, and survival. To understand colonial America, we must understand its councils, its negotiations, and its treaties. Not only those written on paper, but those carried in beads, smoke, and memory. These are the untold stories of indigenous diplomacy. The world before colonization, a world already in motion. Before the first European ships appeared on the Atlantic horizon, North America was not a wilderness waiting to be tamed. It was a living, breathing world of nations, alliances, and ancient diplomacy. Great rivers carried canoes filled with traders. Longhouses echoed with debates among elders. Smoke rose from council fires where decisions shaped the destiny of thousands. The story of diplomacy in colonial America does not begin with colonists. It begins with indigenous nations, whose political systems had been perfected over centuries. Their methods of negotiation, their codes of balance, and their systems of law were already in place long before Europeans set foot on the continent. Indigenous political systems among the Haudenosaunee, known to the French as the Iroquois, 5 nations had bound themselves together in a powerful confederacy. Their great law of peace created a system of checks and balances, where each nation retained its sovereignty while contributing to collective decision-making. The symbol of the confederacy was a great longhouse stretching across the land, with each nation as a fire within its walls. Diplomacy here was not about conquest, but about maintaining harmony. Farther south, the Powhatan chiefdom united more than 30 tribes in the Chesapeake region under a paramount leader, the Mamanatawik. This network ensured security, tribute, and trade across hundreds of miles. Diplomacy was as essential as hunting and farming. No chief could rule without constant negotiation. In the Mississippi Valley, long before European arrival, the mound-building societies had practiced forms of governance that blended ritual with politics. Councils of elders, sacred ceremonies, and trade relationships kept peace between powerful nations. These were not isolated tribes. They were nations with structure, order, and systems of diplomacy equal in sophistication to anything in Europe. Tools of diplomacy, symbols, and rituals. Indigenous diplomacy was steeped in symbolism. Words alone could not be trusted. Promises had to be embodied in objects and rituals. Among the Haudenosaunee, wampum belts made of white and purple shell beads served as living records of treaties. Each belt carried a story, a history, and an obligation. To hold a belt was to hold the memory of an agreement. Across many nations, the calumet, or sacred pipe, was used to sanctify negotiations. Smoke rising into the sky carried prayers, binding participants in a spiritual commitment to peace. Gift-giving was not bribery, but a fundamental principle of diplomacy. A gift acknowledged respect, sealed trust, and balanced relationships. To refuse a gift was to refuse the relationship itself. These traditions ensured that diplomacy was not just political, it was spiritual, communal, and deeply binding. Intertribal diplomacy. Before Europeans, indigenous nations negotiated constantly with one another. Borders were not lines on a map, but zones of interaction, trade, and sometimes tension. In the Northeast, alliances like the Wendat Confederacy worked to maintain balance against rivals like the Haudenosaunee. In the Southeast, the Muskogee Creek people built vast diplomatic networks that tied together dozens of towns into a loose confederation. Across the plains, nations like the Lakota and Dakota navigated alliances with neighbors over hunting grounds and resources. Diplomacy meant survival. It prevented endless cycles of war, facilitated trade of food and resources, and allowed cultures to thrive in a continent of diverse peoples. A different vision of power. Unlike the monarchies of Europe, indigenous governance was often collective, grounded in councils, consensus, and balance. Leaders were chosen not for wealth, but for wisdom, generosity, and oratory skill. A chief who failed to persuade or who ignored the will of the people could lose authority. Women played crucial roles as well. Among the Haudenosaunee, clan mothers appointed and removed male leaders, ensuring that political power rested on balance between genders. Diplomacy was never purely the work of men. It was a shared responsibility that reflected the needs of the whole community. The stage before contact. So when Europeans arrived, they did not step into a vacuum. They entered a continent already filled with diplomats, negotiators, and political traditions. Colonists often misunderstood this world, dismissing native systems as primitive. Yet, as we will see, they quickly learned that survival depended on adapting to indigenous diplomacy. For in the early 1600s, when starving settlers looked to their native neighbors for aid, it was not charity they received, it was negotiation. Aid came with expectations, trade, and agreements. The foundation of colonial America was laid not only with axes and muskets, but with words spoken around council fires. The world before colonization was a world of councils, alliances, and laws. It was a world where power flowed not through domination, but through balance and persuasion. Understanding this foundation is essential because without it, the story of indigenous diplomacy in colonial America makes no sense. Before Europeans began their treaties, before the first conflicts, there was already a continent ruled by the laws of negotiation. This was the world into which colonization stepped. First encounters, early 1600s, the first meetings. The year is 1607. On the shores of a wide river in what would become Virginia, weary English settlers step onto land they call Jamestown. Their clothes are ragged, their supplies nearly gone. Yet they are not alone. Watching from the forests are the Powhatan people, masters of this land for generations. For both sides, the first encounters were moments of uncertainty. The English carried muskets, steel, and fear. The Powhatan carried knowledge of the land, numbers, and power. What followed was not immediate conquest, but negotiation, fragile diplomacy between two worlds that barely understood each other. Language and communication barriers. Imagine two leaders sitting face to face, unable to understand each other's words. This was the first challenge of diplomacy in the 1600s. Language barriers forced both sides to rely on gestures, interpreters, and symbols. Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan, became famous in colonial legends not simply for her association with John Smith, but because she acted as a cultural bridge. Across the continent, other interpreters, men and women who learned both languages, became essential to diplomacy. They did not just translate words, they translated entire worlds. These interpreters often held enormous power, shaping how each side understood the other. Misinterpretation could spark conflict. Careful phrasing could preserve peace. Diplomacy in these early years rested on fragile threads of communication. Trade as diplomacy. The first alliances were often built on trade. For hungry colonists, corn, beans, and squash from native neighbors meant survival. For indigenous nations, iron tools, glass beads, and firearms offered new advantages. But trade was never free. Every exchange was a diplomatic act, a negotiation of balance. The English at Jamestown survived their first winters because Powhatan leaders supplied them with food. But in return, they expected loyalty, respect, and recognition of authority. When colonists failed to honor these agreements, war followed. Similarly, in New France, Samuel de Champlain forged alliances with the Wendat and Algonquin peoples through fur trading networks. These alliances bound the French into indigenous diplomacy, forcing them to fight alongside their native partners in wars against rivals like the Haudenosaunee. Trade was not simply economic, it was the foundation of international relations. Cultural misunderstandings. Early diplomacy was filled with cultural misunderstandings. To Europeans, diplomacy was about written treaties and ownership of land. To indigenous peoples, land could not be owned. It was shared, stewarded, and sacred. When native leaders accepted gifts from colonists, they often meant friendship, alliance, or temporary permission to share resources. But Europeans misinterpreted these exchanges as permanent transfers of land. The seeds of centuries-long conflict were sown in these early misunderstandings. To indigenous leaders, colonists often seemed arrogant, demanding more than they gave. To colonists, indigenous protocols of patience, long debates, ritual feasts, symbolic gifts, felt frustratingly slow. Yet it was the native system, not the European one, that set the rules in these early years. Colonists had no choice but to adapt. Diplomacy for survival. For colonists, diplomacy with native nations was not optional. It was survival. Without native aid, most early settlements would have collapsed. The Mayflower colonists in 1620 endured their first brutal winter in Plymouth, losing half their number. It was only through the diplomacy of Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader, that they survived. Massasoit negotiated an alliance that lasted for decades, balancing the needs of his people with the growing presence of the English. In return, the Wampanoag received protection against rival tribes. For a time, diplomacy created peace in New England. Elsewhere, similar stories unfolded. Dutch settlers relied on the Munsee and Lenape in New Netherland. Spanish missions in Florida and New Mexico survived through fragile treaties with local nations. Survival was always political. Tension and betrayal. But diplomacy was fragile. Agreements often broke under the weight of mistrust. At Jamestown, as English demands grew, the Powhatan realized their guests intended to stay permanently. What began as uneasy trade turned into raids, sieges, and the First Anglo-Powhatan War. In New England, the death of Massasoit and the rise of new colonial leaders eroded the peace. The Wampanoag and their allies watched as colonists expanded relentlessly. Within 2 generations, diplomacy gave way to King Philip's War, one of the bloodiest conflicts in colonial history. The lesson was clear. Early diplomacy was not static. It was a constant balancing act, fragile as glass, easily broken. The first encounters of the 1600s were not mere introductions. They were the foundation of everything that followed. Diplomacy was born out of necessity, shaped by hunger, misunderstanding, and survival. Indigenous leaders quickly realized that Europeans could be allies, rivals, or threats, depending on how negotiations unfolded. Europeans, in turn, learned that they could not simply impose their will. They had to listen, adapt, and enter into native systems of diplomacy, or face destruction. In these first encounters, the balance of power was still uncertain. Indigenous nations held the upper hand, setting the terms of trade, food, and alliance. For the colonists, every step forward depended on the fragile art of diplomacy.